Chapter 1. Central Washington State, 1893. Lily Lexington Bremmer would never let anyone hurt her son again. She stared at the fading green and yellow bruises on her 5-year-old son's neck and pictured the others on his small body. As he lay with his head in her lap, the train rocked back and forth. His arm wrapped around the little toy train engine she'd bought him at one of the stops. It was carved of wood and painted. He didn't play with it, merely held it in the crook of his arm. She combed her fingers through his nearly black soft curls. Her poor son hadn't had toys to play with, but now things were different. The toy train would be the first of many. The train they rode rattled along the track. The Pullman passenger car held nearly 30 people in the 20 seats. Most of the passengers hadn't taken notice of her or her son. People had come and gone over the week-long trip. She was ready to leave this train for good, stretch her legs, breathe fresh air, and wash off the soot and dirt of the journey. She had moved to the front of the car when a seat had opened up. She didn't know why, but she felt safer there. Closer to the door, closer to an escape. The well-groomed man across the aisle in a charcoal gray business suit tossed glances her direction every few minutes. His attention heightened the nervousness of her already jittery insides. Was he interested in her? Or was he trying to puzzle out how a fair-skinned, blonde-haired, blue-eyed woman could have a son with olive skin, dark hair, and rich brown eyes? No matter their contrasting appearances, he was her son. The train's steam whistle blew long and loud. Then the conductor strolled through the car. Next stop, Kamola. Leaning down to where her narrow-brimmed straw hat rested against the wall under the window, she retrieved it and pulled out the 2 adorned hat pins. She secured the hat onto her head as the train rolled into the station and shuddered to a stop. Lily had run almost as far from her past as she could physically get, clear across the country. Toby would be safe here. She rested her hand on part of his little arm she knew didn't have any bruises, and gently shook her son awake. "We're here. Time to wake up." He blinked his brown eyes at her. Why did he have to look so much like his father? But now that they were starting over, she didn't have to call him by his father's name, even if he was a junior. She would use his nickname, Toby. No one to order her not to. Toby wrestled around to a sitting position, then leaned against her arm. His dejected expression pulled on her heartstrings. Maybe he was just tired. The past week had been hard for them both. She shifted her son away from leaning against her, stood, and tugged on the hem of the gray striped jacket of her traveling suit. Reaching up to the polished wooden shelf overhead, she pulled down the larger of their 2 carpet bags, the one made of pink floral carpet, and set it on the green plush bench next to her little boy. Then the smaller tan and black one. They didn't have a lot, but they had each other. Standing in the aisle with her reticule hanging from one waist, she grabbed a carpet bag in each hand. "Hold on to Mommy's sleeve." "I'm too tired." Toby slumped over on the bench. "Toby, please, I need you to walk. I have to carry our bags." He lay lethargic and only blinked at her. She tucked the smaller carpet bag under her arm so it partially rested on the one in her hand. She held out her free arm. "Okay, stand up and I'll carry you." Toby slipped his thumb into his mouth but didn't move. She wished he wouldn't do that, but hated to tell him not to after all he'd been through in his short life. So she clenched her teeth in frustration. She couldn't do everything. She needed him to at least stand. "All right, if you won't move, I'll have to leave you on the train. Goodbye." As she turned, Toby grabbed her sleeve. "Don't go." She turned around, and Toby stood on the bench with his arms outstretched, his engine in one hand. She wrapped her free arm around him and settled him on her hip. He hugged her around her neck and put his head on her shoulder. His elbow and train pressed painfully into healing bruises on her back. She ignored the discomfort and kissed the top of his head. Getting off the train without falling was her main concern. Though small and thin, carrying Toby as well as the carpetbags was all a bit cumbersome. She shuffled sideways in the aisle to the exit, looking at the steps, and hesitated, hoping she didn't miss any of them. She situated herself so she would descend with Toby first. But what if she tripped? She would land on her baby. With her hands full, she wouldn't have the benefit of holding onto the brass handrail. She backed up and shifted around so the carpetbags descended first. They wouldn't be a soft landing, but she wouldn't injure her son. Before attempting the first step, she contemplated tossing the bags to the platform, but her mother's hand mirror might get broken. The other disembarking passengers lined up behind her. One of them called out, "Can you hurry, ma'am?" She couldn't do this safely and stepped out of the way. "Go ahead." The first man, the one in the business suit, scowled at her as he passed and stepped off the train. He must be the one who'd asked her to hurry. Next came a couple of men who appeared to be cowboys, one with a saddle slung over his shoulder, then an older man and woman, and several other people alighted from the coach. The last passenger, another man, stopped in front of her. Even at her own height of 5'7" the man towered over her. Dressed in a black canvas duster and a black crease-topped hat, he also looked like a cowboy, but less trail-haggard. Was he going to scowl at her too? He extended his hand. At this simple courtesy, she flinched. After pulling out the carpetbag wedged under her arm, he tucked it under his own above his smaller brown carpetbag. "Let me get these." "That's all right. I can manage." His smile added to the kindness in his meadow-green eyes. "I saw how you were managing. I wouldn't want you to fall and hurt yourself or your boy." He took her other bag and stepped off the train. After setting all 3 bags on the ground, he turned and held out his hand. She stared at it. Dare she take it? Hands could be kind or cruel. His hand inched higher. "I don't have a rattlesnake, ma'am." Giving a wan smile, she shifted Toby on her hip and placed her hand in the cowboy's. His fingers wrapped around hers. His hold was gentle yet firm enough to keep her steady. After stepping down, she retrieved her hand. "Thank you." "You're welcome." He tipped his hat, then glanced around. "Is your husband on board?" "No, I'm a widow." Why had she told him that? Would it have been better to let him believe her husband would be along soon? He probably already figured out that she was alone. He had been in the passenger car for the past 2 days. "You have family or friends meeting you here?" No sense denying it. She shook her head. She was alone. Just her and Toby, making a new start. He took off his hat, showing a shock of light brown hair matted down, and held his hat to his chest. "I'm Edric Hammond, at your service." He waited. If she planned to stay in this town, there was no point in not introducing herself. He and everyone else would learn her name soon enough. "I'm Lily Lexington." Now that she was a widow, she would use her maiden name again. "This is my son, Toby." "Pleased to meet you both." He returned his hat to his head and picked up all 3 bags. She waggled her free hand. "I can get those." His gaze shifted from her to Toby. "You have your hands full. Where are you staying?" "I don't want to inconvenience you." "No inconvenience. Where to?" Her only thought a week ago had been to flee. Leave as fast as she could before anyone stopped her. Where she would end up or what to do once there hadn't entered her thinking. I don't know. I'm new in town. Is there a hotel close by?" "The White Hotel is right across the street. Are you staying in town long?" Why so many questions? "We plan to settle here." "Then you'll want to stay at Aunt Henny's until you find a place. It will be cheaper by the week and more comfortable. And Aunt Henny will be glad for the female company." So that was why he wanted to know. "I don't want to inconvenience your aunt." "She's not my aunt. Well, she's more like everyone's aunt. Everyone calls her Aunt Henny. I'm not even sure if anyone in town is related to her. She runs a boarding house." She liked that idea. "Is it far?" "Right up the street." He eyed Toby. "Is he getting heavy? Do you want me to carry him?" Toby tightened his grip around her neck. She instinctively squeezed him in return. Let a stranger have him? No, I'm fine. If you'd like to wait here, I can get a buggy. No, I'm fine. She didn't want to put him out or owe him anything, and walking would be nice after being cooped up on the train. I can walk. He nodded. Right this way. He sauntered around the side of the station, and his long strides carried him across the dusty street in no time. Unable to match his pace, she took quick steps, kicking at the hem of her traveling suit skirt. She managed to mostly keep up. Not knowing his temperament, she would not risk angering him. He stepped up onto the boardwalk, stopped, and turned to her with a frown. Her own stride faltered. What had she done to upset him? He dipped his head. I'm sorry for leaving you behind. I forget most people can't keep up with my long legs, and I'm often in a hurry to get places. So he wasn't mad at her. She stepped up onto the boardwalk. If you have some place to be, I can take our bags. Point the way. We'll manage. I'll not be rude twice in one meeting. His mouth pulled up into a smile then. Besides, if Aunt Henny found out I abandoned a lady new to town, she would give me a tongue lashing like there was no tomorrow. I don't want to keep you from your business. This won't take long. I wouldn't want to raise Aunt Henny's ire. She is not a person I want upset at me. He winked. Who was this Aunt Henny? Should Lily be afraid of her? Shall we? He took one tentative stride. She nodded and fell into step beside him. Where do you hail from? He asked. Philadelphia. He let out a long whistle. You've come a long way, and with no family or friends to meet you. What brings you to our fair town? I'm running away. But she couldn't tell him that. After my husband passed, I wanted to move as far away as I could. Well, I do believe you succeeded. Toby grew heavy in her arms. She shifted him. A week of train travel had taken its toll and made her worn out and weary. What little sleep she had managed to get had been poor. Hoping the boarding house wasn't far, she gazed up at the white hotel as they passed under its awning. Maybe they should have stayed there, at least for one night. The parts of town she could see told her that this wasn't a large place, but neither was it a small prairie settlement. Several blocks wide and several blocks deep, some 3 or 4 stories high brick buildings in amongst the wooden ones. They stepped off the boardwalk, crossed an alley street, and back up onto the next boardwalk. They did this 3 or more times before the businesses gave way to homes. A large white house stood a short distance ahead. She would like staying there. But Mr. Hammond walked right on by. Then another and another. How far was this place? Her idea of not far and Mr. Hammond's differed vastly. But then, if she wasn't so exhausted, it might not seem far. Her arms screamed in pain from holding Toby. She wanted to set him down, but knew he was too tired to walk, and too afraid. She was almost too spent to walk herself. Is it much farther? He pointed with her pink floral carpetbag. That greenhouse right there. A mint green, 2-story house stood in a chaos of brightly colored flowers inside a white picket fence. A front porch that stretched across the front, welcoming, and a sign out front that read, Aunt Henny's Boarding House, home to the weary traveler. She was definitely a weary traveler. A sigh escaped her. Home. It felt like home, or at least a home, warm and inviting. It had been a long time since she'd felt at home anywhere. Mr. Hammond unlatched the gate and held it open for her. She nodded her thanks as she stepped through the opening and walked up the red brick path to the door. The porch held 4 rocking chairs, 2 at each end. Each pair flanked a small table. Mr. Hammond set the 3 bags down and knocked on the door. It pulled open to reveal a middle-aged woman with pinched lips, squinty eyes, and her graying hair pulled up in a severe knot on top of her head. She eyed Mr. Hammond, blocking the doorway, not inviting them in. nor did she appear as though she ever would. This woman did not seem friendly at all. No wonder Mr. Hammond was afraid of her. The White Hotel was looking better all the time. Mr. Hammond pulled his mouth into a congenial smile. "Mrs. Martin, how are you faring on this fine day?" "Don't try to charm me, Edric Hammond. You think with an agreeable smile and dashing good looks you can get whatever you want. I know your kind. You can't fool me." He removed his hat and held it to his chest. "I'm trying no such thing. I've brought a boarder for Aunt Henny." Lily breathed a sigh of relief that this disagreeable woman was not Aunt Henny. She didn't think she could board with someone so unpleasant on a first meeting. Mrs. Martin squinted at Lily. "Henny isn't taking on any boarders at this time. Show her to the hotel." "All her rooms are taken?" If she wouldn't have to walk and carry Toby, and if she weren't so tired, she would gladly return to the hotel. As it was, her arms ached to set Toby down, but he held her tightly around the neck, nearly choking her. Mrs. Martin folded her arms across her ample bosom. "She has no boarders. I sent them away." Mr. Hammond's smile disappeared and his eyebrows rose. "Mr. Lombard and Mr. Tunstall? Why on earth would you do such a thing? Aunt Henny depends on boarders." "Henny is in no condition to have boarders." Mr. Hammond's eyebrows now pulled together in concern. "Condition? What's wrong with her?" From somewhere inside, a woman's voice called out, "Who's there? Agnes?" When Mrs. Martin turned to answer, Mr. Hammond took the opportunity to scoot past her and disappeared inside. "Mr. Hammond!" Mrs. Martin followed him. What should Lily do now? She could hear voices, but not what they were saying. Stay or flee? The voices raised an argument. She should go. Could she pick up their carpet bags without releasing Toby? Maybe one of them, but not both. "Toby, sweetie, Mommy needs you to stand for one little moment." She leaned over and pulled Toby's legs off from around her waist. His grip tightened around her neck. "Please, Toby, Mommy needs to pick up our bags. Then I'll carry you." As soon as she got his feet to touch the ground, he drew them up again and hung from her neck. His weight knocked her off balance and she reached out to catch herself, but found two strong hands around her, one on her wrist and the other around her waist. She sucked in a breath. Tobias! Turning, she yanked away and saw Mr. Hammond's startled expression. Toby gripped her tighter, clamping his legs around her waist, and held her with the force of a bear. She tottered on the edge of the top step. If she dropped Toby, he would land fine and she might be able to catch herself, but Toby would never let go of her. She would fall and would have to hope she didn't break any bones when she landed at the bottom of the 4 steps. Mr. Hammond's eyes enlarged with surprise, his arms outstretched. "Whoa there!" He grabbed both her upper arms on still tender bruises. For a moment, she thought he might tumble off the porch with them, but he yanked her toward him. She stopped safely against his chest, with Toby in between them. Toby whimpered. Mr. Hammond's green eyes stared at her. She stared too. He'd saved her from a nasty tumble. Both he and she breathed heavily from the episode. He cleared his throat. "I'm sorry for startling you." Startling her? More like terrifying her to her innermost depths. Not really him, but the image of Tobias that Mr. Hammond's touch had evoked. She could feel a burst of tears welling up inside her. She could not cry here and now, in front of a stranger. She clamped her teeth together, took a deep breath, and swallowed her emotions. "Yes, I was startled. I'm sorry for reacting so. I'm quite exhausted from traveling. I'm sure that's why." Toby wriggled in her arms, likely to get Mr. Hammond to let go of them. Mr. Hammond took Toby's hint and stepped back, but kept his hands on her upper arms. "Are you steady now?" She nodded. "Yes, thank you." He slowly released her arms, and when he seemed satisfied that she wouldn't fall over again, he let his arms drop to his sides. "I thought you two were going to tumble headlong off the porch for sure." "If not for your assistance, we would have." Now she owed him something for saving her and Toby. She hadn't wanted to be beholden to anyone. "I'm glad I was able to avert a tragedy." His gaze searched her face. After an uncomfortable moment, he cleared his throat again. "Do you cook?" Taken aback by his sudden subject change, she answered, "Yes," then regretted it. Why would he be asking her such a question when they'd just met? Cleaning and housekeeping? Why was he asking her these questions? He wasn't interviewing her for a wife, was he? She wasn't that beholden to him. Chapter 2. "Mr. Hammond, I don't think—" A voice from inside called. "Edric, what are you doing? Bring her inside." Mr. Hammond held open the screen door. "Aunt Henny is anxious to meet you." Lily wasn't sure she wanted to enter, but she adjusted Toby and stepped over the threshold. Mr. Hammond picked up her 2 carpetbags and set them inside the front door. Then he walked a little deeper in the house and motioned to the left. "Mrs. Lexington, may I present Aunt Henny? This is Mrs. Lexington and her son Toby." Lily turned to see a middle-aged woman with her brown hair pulled over her shoulder in a braid, reclining on a settee. A stack of pillows propped up her casted right leg. On her lap sat a red and yellow quilt square. She waved Lily over. "Come in, dear child. Sit. You must be exhausted." Lily let her shoulders relax slightly at the woman's friendliness. "Thank you, but I'll stand." If she sat down, she would likely not get up again. And not knowing if she was going to be allowed to stay here, she didn't want to risk it. "Poor thing. You must be simply too exhausted to even think straight." The woman called Aunt Henny shifted her gaze to Mr. Hammond. "Edric, take her bags up to the first room on the right." She looked at Lily again. "It has a nice view of the meadow and the mountains in the distance." Mrs. Martin planted her hands on her hips. "Henny, you are in no condition to take on any boarders at present, especially a boarder with a child." "Agnes, I appreciate your concern for me, but I'll be fine. I'm not an invalid." Mrs. Martin let out a huff of air. "I'm only looking out for your well-being. I haven't the time to take care of you and your boarders." "I appreciate all you've done for me, but I think the Lord has it covered now." Mrs. Martin's gaze darted from Aunt Henny to Lily and back. "I'll stop by in the morning to check on you." "I'd like that. See you tomorrow." Mrs. Martin left. Aunt Henny sighed. "She means well." The older woman gazed at Lily. "Please, sit." Lily hadn't realized that she had not only been staring like a person touched in the head, but she was leaning on the entry frame to the room. She straightened and was about to decline when Mr. Hammond appeared at her elbow and guided her to a chair. She sat without thinking. Her body relaxed into the soft padding. She would never get up now. She shifted Toby sideways on her lap. "Edric, would you fetch us all some water?" Mr. Hammond left and returned shortly with 3 glasses resting in one upturned hand, with a plate of cookies balanced on top, and a 4th glass in his other hand. My, he has big hands! A shiver ran up Lily's spine. He gave a glass of water to Aunt Henny first. Aunt Henny took the water, then flicked a hand in Lily's direction. Mr. Hammond set the cookies and 1 water on the tea table and brought Lily a glass. She thanked him and took a long drink of the cool liquid. She hadn't realized how thirsty she was. Then he knelt and held out a half-full glass to Toby. "Are you thirsty?" Toby nodded, then hid his face in Lily's chest. "Thank you. I'll give him some of mine." "He's awfully shy." He had his father to thank for that. "He's tired from the trip." Lily felt a bit refreshed already. Maybe she hadn't been so much exhausted as she was thirsty. She held the glass out to Toby. Instead of taking it, he put his mouth on the rim and pushed the edge down. He had reverted to being helpless. The trip and all the new people must be overwhelming him. She tipped the glass while Toby slurped a drink. Mr. Hammond knelt in front of Toby again, holding out a molasses cookie. "Would you like one?" Toby nodded, but didn't reach for the treat. He looked up at Lily. She nodded. "You may have it." Toby glanced at the treat and then at her again. She knew what he wanted. He wanted her to get it for him. He was afraid to reach out toward the man, a stranger. She didn't like her son acting helpless. If he was going to grow into a self-sufficient man, he needed to do for himself. He wasn't an infant. "If you want the cookie, you'll have to take it yourself." Toby pushed out his bottom lip, then looked at the cookie. Mr. Hammond waited patiently while Toby stared at the treat. Finally, Toby lifted the hand without the train and inched it toward the molasses cookie, testing whether or not he would get slapped or the treat would be pulled out of his reach. He retracted his hand 3 times before he touched the cookie with one finger. When no reprimand or blow came, he took it between 2 fingers. Mr. Hammond's smile broadened as he let go. "Say thank you." She hoped her son wasn't too frightened. He whispered something that could have been thank you, but it was hard to tell. Then he turned his face into her. "You're welcome. That's an awfully nice engine you have there." Toby curled his arm tighter around the train and held it closer. Mr. Hammond reached for the plate and held it out to her. "Cookie?" "Thank you." She took one and bit it, enjoying the sweetness. Replacing the plate on the table, he took one and sat in a wooden rocking chair by the unlit fireplace. Toby just held his cookie, still not sure if he would really be allowed to eat it. How often had his father given him a treat or toy, only to have it slapped out of his hand and crushed under his father's boot? Toby needed to learn that not every man behaved as badly as his father had. "So," Aunt Henny said, "Edric tells me you'll be staying a while with me." The poor woman was injured. Mrs. Martin was right that Aunt Henny couldn't take on boarders. "I don't want to impose. You are obviously in no condition to have us here. We can go to the hotel." "Nonsense. Edric tells me you can cook and clean." He dipped his head in a sheepish manner. "That's why I was asking you about housekeeping." So he wasn't scouting for a wife. He was probably married anyway, being strong and handsome as he was. He carried himself like a man who took command wherever he went. And that frightened her a little. But strangely, there was comfort there too. He had been kind to her, but then so had Tobias, in the beginning. "If you will do a little cooking and cleaning for me, you and your boy can stay here at no charge. You would need to gather the eggs and tend the garden. You'd be earning your keep. It would help me as well as Agnes. She's been running herself ragged these last 3 days, taking care of her family and looking in on me. What do you say?" "I would be more than happy to do what I can to help." Then Lily remembered what Mr. Hammond said about this woman needing the income from boarders. "Would you like Mr. Hammond to tell your boarders to return?" "You don't need to do that," Aunt Henny said. "You'll have plenty to keep you busy taking care of me and your boy." "It won't be that much more work to cook for a few more rather than 3. I'm sure you depend on the income you receive. Since we won't be generating any by staying here, we can at least help you retain what you formerly had." Mr. Hammond spoke up then. "I had a feeling bringing you here was what God intended." God? How long had it been since she had thought about God? Hadn't he abandoned her a long time ago? And after what she had done, he wasn't likely to be looking out for her ever again. Aunt Henny clapped her hands. "Then it's settled. But if you find having the extra boarders here is too much work, let me know. I can survive without boarders for a couple of months." "I will," Such a blessing to have a roof over her head and work to do that allowed her to keep Toby with her. What little money she had wouldn't last long if she had to pay for her lodging. "Do you mind if I ask what happened to you?" "Stepped in a gopher hole. Doc says I'm going to be laid up for some time." Toby, still holding on to his cookie, rose up, put his mouth to her ear, and spoke so soft she could barely hear him. "I gotta go potty." Mercy, she better be quick. Toby often waited until it was almost too late. As she stood with Toby in her arms, she tried taking his cookie and spoke. "Where can I find the necessary?" "No, my cookie." "Edric, would you show her the way?" Aunt Henny motioned toward the back of the house. "You can't take it with you. It will be here when you return." Lily pulled the cookie and it broke. Toby fisted his hand with the remainder of the crumbled cookie. She set the broken pieces on the edge of the plate. Mr. Hammond walked through the house and across the kitchen and held open the screen door for her. Then he pointed. "Right out there." She nodded her thank you and rushed to the small building. She set Toby on the floor, but as she fumbled with the buttons on his trousers, a dark, wet spot grew on the front of them. Too late. She sighed and leaned against the wall in the confined space. At least he had held it long enough not to wet her as well. "I didn't make it. I'm sorry, Mommy." "I know, sweetie." She knelt. "Let's get these wet things off you." She untied and removed his brogans, pulled off his wet socks, then his trousers and underclothes. "Wait here while I get you dry clothes." Toby threw his arms around her neck. "Don't leave me!" She hugged him close. "I won't." She hated her baby being so afraid. In time, their new life would change that. "Let's take off your jacket and tie it around your waist." Once his coat was in place, she rolled up his wet socks and underclothes in his trousers and handed Toby his brogans. "You need to carry these." Toby wrapped one thin arm around them and held them to his chest, keeping tight hold of his train. She scooped him up in one arm and grabbed his wet things with her other hand. As she approached the back porch, the screen door swung open, and Mr. Hammond stood next to it. He'd been waiting for her. Since he was not Tobias, it was likely a simple kindness and not a trap. She dropped Toby's wet things on the porch step and entered. "Thank you." As she passed by Mr. Hammond, Toby hid his face in her shoulder and tightened his grip around her neck. She whispered to him, "It's all right." She entered the parlor. "I need to get him fresh clothes. Which room did you say would be ours?" Aunt Henny smiled in an understanding way. "The first door on the right. Edric, did you take her bags up?" "Not yet." He stepped past her and picked up the carpet bags. "Right this way." "I can get those." "You have your hands full." He pointed up the stairs with the smaller bag. "After you." She climbed the stairs and her earlier fatigue hit her in the legs. She wished Toby would walk, but knew better than to try, especially with Mr. Hammond so close. As she was about to reach for the doorknob, Mr. Hammond extended his hand. "Let me get that." More out of fear from her late husband's rage than of following proper etiquette, she sidestepped, allowing him to open the door. He did and stepped aside for her to enter first. Her insides turned, but then she remembered he wasn't Tobias and Aunt Henny was right downstairs. The room glowed with the afternoon sun radiating in, a cheerful place with a pink patchwork quilt on the double bed. Tears pricked her eyes at the welcoming sight. She and Toby would be safe. She wanted to crawl under the quilt and sleep. Mr. Hammond crossed to the bed and set the carpetbags down. Then he left without a word and shut the door. Toby finally lifted his head from her shoulder. "He didn't hit me or nothing." "Of course not." "Unlike a week ago." "But I wet myself." She set him on the floor and knelt in front of him. "I took you far, far away so no one would ever hurt you again. You're safe here. We both are." He blinked at her. No emotions registered on his sweet little face. Did he believe her? She wished he would smile. It had been so very long since he had. Maybe in time he would feel safe and smile for her. A soft knock sounded on the door. She started. Who could that be? She stood and opened the door slowly. Mr. Hammond held a basin with a pitcher of water in it. "Aunt Henny asked me to bring these up. The water is warm." His boots thumped on the floor as he stepped inside, then placed the basin and pitcher in the hole in the washstand. He took 2 towels from over his shoulder and hung them on the side of the stand. "Thank you." With a quick nod, he left. For such a large man, he didn't seem threatening. He seemed meek and mild. Could he even be pushed to anger? Of course he could. He was a man after all. She washed up Toby and put dry clothes on him, but left his brogans off. "Shall we go downstairs?" Toby shook his head. She didn't want to fight with him. "All right, you stay up here. I'll be downstairs." "Don't leave me!" Toby tucked his train under his arm and grabbed her hand. "I need to go back down. Etiquette dictated she must. You can come with me." Toby shook his head so his whole body twisted back and forth and swung her arm with him. She knew he wouldn't want to stay up here alone. She needed to entice him. "Your cookie is downstairs." Toby released her hand, grabbed his train, and held his arms up to her. His one hand was still fisted around the bit of cookie he had. Her muscles almost cried out at the thought of carrying him. "You can hold my hand on the way down and sit on my lap when we get there." "No!" He wrapped his slender arms around her legs. She pulled him free and knelt in front of him again. "I'm too tired to carry you, so if you want your cookie, you will have to walk." She stood and held out her hand to him. He shook his head. "Very well, I'll be up later." She turned away from him and opened the door. Toby latched onto her hand and leaned into her side, the train once more under his arm. Once downstairs, she sat. "Go get your cookie. It's on the edge of the plate." He looked from his cookie pieces, then over to Mr. Hammond across the room. He must have determined that the large stranger was far too close to risk it, and scrambled up onto her lap. Then he opened his hand with the mashed part of the cookie in it and shoved the crumbs into his mouth. Maybe he was afraid that too would be taken from him. Toby needed to learn that not everyone was out to hurt him. He had reached for a cookie once without consequence. As much as she wanted to simply hand him the treat herself, she knew this was an opportunity for him to experience something new, something strange, something good for them both. Mr. Hammond stood, took a fresh cookie from the plate, and held it out to her boy. If Toby wasn't going to get one for himself, he would at least have to take it from Mr. Hammond. Toby reached out his hand but stopped just short of touching the cookie and looked up at this man offering him kindness. Mr. Hammond nodded and smiled, a kind smile. Toby grabbed the treat and clutched it to his chest. "What do you say?" The 2 words were fast and soft. "You're welcome." Mr. Hammond stood to his full height that had to be well over 6 feet. "I should be getting home." "Naturally," Aunt Henny said. "I'm sure you're anxious to see Estella and Nancy. Give them a hug for me."